It's the Real News Network, and I'm Ben Norton. World leaders representing the largest economies are meeting in Argentina this weekend for the annual G20 summit. This year's summit is marked by a few major issues and controversies, including the fight over oil prices, the aftermath of Saudi Arabia's brutal killing of royalist Jamal Khashoggi, the trade war between the United States and China, and new relations over oil between India, China, Saudi Arabia, and other countries. CNN noted this year that oil is one of the key topics at the summit. CNN pointed out that the price of U.S. crude has dropped around 20% just in this month of November, and some countries are complaining about oversupply. At the G20 this year, the leaders of Russia and Saudi Arabia, two of the largest oil producers, will be meeting to discuss oil. Russian President Vladimir Putin and Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman want to decrease the supply of oil in order to increase its price. U.S. President Donald Trump, on the other hand, wants the price of oil not just to stay down, but to drop even further. On November 21st, Trump tweeted, "Oil prices getting lower, great, like a big tax cut for America and the world. Enjoy, $54 was just $82. Thank you to Saudi Arabia, but let's go lower." That was Donald Trump tweeting. Russia has actually reduced its oil output before the meeting that it's going to have at the G20 with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. But what's also interesting, and an angle that's not getting nearly enough attention in the US media, is that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia also met with India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi to discuss oil, and India is trying to diversify its oil imports. And then, of course, all of this comes after increased scrutiny of the Saudi kingdom, and specifically the Crown Prince, in light of the assassination of Khashoggi in Turkey on October 2nd. So joining us to unpack all of this is scholar Vijay Prashad. Vijay is an Indian historian and journalist. He is the author of 24 books and is the director of the international think tank, the Tricontinental. Thanks for joining us, Vijay.
Thanks a lot.
So there's a lot to talk about here, and I want to talk about these different angles. I mean, there's the trade war between the U.S. and China. There's, of course, oil. But let's begin. An important point that's not getting a lot of attention in the U.S. media is this meeting between the Indian Prime Minister Modi and Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi Crown Prince, and specifically their discussions of oil. So can you talk about the importance of this and why you think this issue should be getting more attention?
Ben, the interesting thing is that there's a lot of discussion about the role of Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, his role in the war in Yemen, his role recently in the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. This is where I think a lot of the press, particularly in the West, has focused. I think less attention has been paid to developments around the oil markets and the role of Mohammed bin Salman and Asia. Ever since the United States reinstated sanctions against Iran, this has put a lot of pressure on Asian countries, China, India, Japan, even countries like Sri Lanka, Malaysia, and so on, having a hard time with their oil imports because they've come to rely on Iranian oil. The reason they don't buy Saudi oil, and they buy Saudi oil, but not at the same levels as they're going to, is because Saudi Arabia has had erratic oil prices. There's been problems with Saudi light crude. They prefer to buy the medium and hard crude, which is closer to the Iranian oil. There's been several problems. And during the course of this year, Mohammed bin Salman's team inside Saudi Arabia has tried to settle some of these issues. So, for instance, in terms of pricing, the benchmark price in Saudi Arabia has now been diversified. The Dubai and Oman benchmarks have been combined. This is actually quite advanced in terms of predicting prices. Saudi Arabia has also faced something that's been going on since 2005, which is India and China considering building a oil buyers club. OPEC is the organization of oil producers. India and China have been thinking of setting up an oil buyers club which is going to set a buying price. So Saudi Arabia has had to deal with that as well. I just want to put this on the table for us to understand that when Narendra Modi and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman met in Buenos Aires just before the group of 20 countries met with their meeting, on the table was oil, not the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, not the war on Yemen. And it's oil that's on the top of the agenda because this week in Vienna, both OPEC and non OPEC countries had a very important meeting where they discussed again the question of oil prices. And the OPEC bloc is largely led by Saudi Arabia, the non OPEC bloc is led by Russia. And so here you have, a perfect storm this week of conversations about oil, some of it sparked by the US sanctions against Iran, which has really taken off sections of Asia from being able to buy from Iran. And it's increased pressure on these countries to start buying from Saudi Arabia. So, in a sense, the economics has overcome the kind of moral political debate that was supposed to be held around the question of the legitimacy of Mohammed bin Salman's rule and his role both in the war in Yemen and in the killing of Khashoggi.
There's a lot to respond to there, and I do want to talk about Khashoggi. But before that, let's talk a bit more about India and oil. We saw that the U.S. for the past year has been pressuring India to cut its oil imports of Iranian oil. India and Iran have a very close trading relationship when it comes to oil. In fact, India is the second largest purchaser of Iranian oil. And Narendra Modi was considering cutting Iranian oil to appease the U.S. He actually ended up backing off and is continuing imports of Iranian oil, but he's looking to diversify India's oil imports. And I think that's part of the reason behind the meeting with Saudi Arabia. So can you talk more about India's role in this and the pressure on India to cut its oil relations with Iran rather, especially in light of the fact that since the election of Narendra Modi, this is a far-right nationalist who was elected in 2014 of the BJP party, India's relations with the U.S. and also with Israel have greatly increased. And one would think that that would actually pressure India to weaken its relations with Iran.
Well, it's difficult for India to pivot 180 degrees away from Iran for several reasons. I think the most important reason is the one we've already started to talk about, which is the question of oil imports. India is entirely reliant on the import of oil, and Iran plays a very important role here in terms of providing oil on a reasonable basis. The prices are good, the oil is excellent, and Iran is nearby, so the transport costs are not very high. And India, even though it received immense pressure from George W. Bush's administration, now in the 2000s, 2003, 4, and 5, immense pressure. In fact, George W. Bush administration said that it would take India out of, the kind of diplomatic isolation after India had done its second set of nuclear tests, and said it would provide India with guarantees in the nuclear suppliers group so that India could get, uranium and other materials for its nuclear reactors. What the United States was saying was, increase your use of energy from nuclear and cut your ties with Iran. That was the promise in the Bush administration. Of course, energy from nuclear, even in the most optimistic scenario for India, is minuscule. And the reliance on Iran continued. So right during the most difficult period of sanctions, India was importing oil from Iran. When Mr. Trump tried to cajole India and other countries to back him with this new sanctions regime, it was not only India, but even Japan, very close American ally, that said that no, they would not like to go along with the American sanctions on Iran because these countries rely on Iranian oil. So this is a very important part of India's framework. The other side is that, despite the fact that this right-wing government, would like to have much closer ties with Israel, United States, and so on, there remains a very strong sensibility inside India's diplomatic community, inside its political community towards the non-aligned movement. And I don't think this should be set aside and mocked. I think this is a serious debate inside India. And Mr. Modi has found it hard to pivot fully away from the non-aligned perspective. Linked to this, as far as Mr. Modi is concerned, is he's up for re-election next year. The Indian economy is in very poor state. Inflation is high. Ordinary goods cost has gone up because oil prices inside India remain high, despite the fact that internationally they are down. So Mr. Modi is under pressure to balance the economic question. So I think ideology here is getting slightly slapped around by the practical nature of where India is today.
Now let's pivot a bit and talk about Russia, Saudi, and OPEC. We saw the recent announcement that there's going to be a meeting between Putin and MBS. We actually saw that during the Olympics, there was another meeting, and specifically during the OPEC, or what was called the OPEC Plus negotiations, there were similar discussions and negotiations between Saudi and Russia, and in fact, against the will of the U.S. Saudi Arabia is, of course, in many ways a kind of client state of the U.S., but under MBS, we actually have seen the country in a few different ways, including arms sales and oil production. We've seen it kind of deviate from the U.S. line and in some ways collaborate with Russia. And I'm wondering, we were talking about the Khashoggi killing, and as horrible as it is, of course, Saudi Arabia is committing many worse crimes on a daily basis in Yemen. At least 85,000 children have died from starvation and disease, and that's likely a very conservative estimate, along with tens of thousands more killed in the actual violence. That, interestingly, has not gotten much attention in the U.S. media. It's getting more attention because U.S. politicians and lawmakers are trying to push back against U.S. support for the war. But of course, it exposes this double standard, and it makes one question why the Khashoggi killing is so highlighted. And specifically, we can't get into the role of Turkey and other countries in all of this and this kind of Middle East realignment. But really what I'm getting at is, do you think that one of the reasons that this Khashoggi killing is being so highlighted, one of the reasons the CIA has come out pretty openly against Mohammed bin Salman, is precisely not because of the Khashoggi killing, that's certainly part of it, but rather because of his willingness to diversify Saudi's oil deals with other countries, his move not necessarily away from the U.S., but toward a kind of more international multipolar approach to politics, and the relations we see with countries like not just Russia, but India and China?
I mean, Ben, what you're saying requires a lot of thought, and it will take a lot of time to go into this, because you're quite right. The principal issue here is the realignment taking place in West Asia and North Africa, the role of the Muslim Brotherhood, the fact that Qatar is essentially, in the penalty box, and Turkey has taken on the role as the standard bearer for the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, there's a lot to be said there, but let's keep that aside as you did and come to, I think, the heart of the question, which is that, low oil prices are good for Donald Trump and perhaps the American consumer and so on. But low oil prices have hit Saudi Arabia hard. I mean, their revenues have deteriorated. There's been internal problems. This pivot that Mr. Mohammed bin Salman wants to be the architect of, towards a non-oil future is not possible unless there is oil revenue and the sovereign fund of Saudi Arabia increases dramatically. You can't build a city, for instance, unless you're awash in oil funds. The Saudis are very keen on building a major city, which will be a kind of city of the 22nd century. Saudis need to move away from, oil and date production and diversify the economy. I mean, this was part of Vision 2020, which was Mohammed bin Salman's plan for Saudi Arabia. So I think there is some eagerness inside the Saudi regime to raise oil prices so that their revenues can increase. I think here there is sympathy in Moscow, because Russia wants oil prices to go up as well. The problem is that it's not so easy for the Saudis to just raise oil prices because they are yet partly a client state of the United States. And I don't think he's going to have an easy time. And, everybody I've spoken to who's at the Vienna meeting of OPEC and non-OPEC actors has said that the debate between Saudi Arabia and Russia has been quite, stern. It's a difficult discussion because Russia is very eager for prices to start moving upward as quickly as January. And Saudi Arabia is not able to actually move to higher oil prices. I mean, you've seen the reaction from Trump thanking Saudi Arabia, asking them to go even lower. So I think Saudi Arabia is in the middle of a series of important contradictions. There's the political issue of the question of Saudi Arabia versus the Muslim Brotherhood and so on. And then there's this economic issue where, they are actually operating against their own country's interests by keeping oil prices low. And I think this is going to be a problem at the G20 meeting, where discussions are going to go into oil prices. And it's going to be a serious problem next year when Saudi revenues are going to continue to decline.
We'll have to end it there, Vijay, but I would love to have you back to discuss some of those other issues, to unpack some of the nuance in all of this. But we were joined by Vijay Prashad. Vijay is an Indian historian and journalist and the author of 24 books. He is also the director of the international think tank, the Tricontinental. As always, thanks so much for joining us, Vijay.
Thanks a lot, Ben.
For the Real News Network, I'm Ben Norton.